Hey folks, Darren at Fervent Astronomy. Today I have a lens review that I really should have done probably like 8 months ago, but you know what? I reviewed a Viltrox lens instead and then got distracted for the better part of a year. So I am going to rectify that today, because today we're looking at the Sigma 14mm f1.4 for, wait a minute. Nope. There we go. The Sigma 14mm f1.4 DG DN for the Sony E mount and Leica L mount. And maybe if some of y'all are lucky down the road, Nikon or Canon mounts. But this lens, as you can see, is pretty big. If no one got the joke here, this is Sigma's 105mm f1.4 DG HSM. Lovingly known as the bokeh master. And I mean, this 14mm lens is big. That's my point. It's big. That said, let's actually take a look at it. It's got a luckily tripod foot and collar here, which is Arca Swiss compatible. As with many Sigma lenses that are recent, we do have a nice clicky aperture ring. And I'm just realizing that I forgot that this one actually has a lock. So if you are the type of person who just hates those aperture rings, you don't want to accidentally knock it and go from one aperture to another, or from auto to manual, or vice versa. Well, luckily for you, you can lock the ring in auto, or in one of the or in the manual range at the very least. Of course, we have our usual manual focus, autofocus switch. We've got a custom button there. And as with Sigma's 20mm 1.4 from a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, what is time? We do have a manual focus lock switch, so that when you take this nicely dampened, rather large manual focus ring and you get perfect focus on the stars, you can then lock it so you don't accidentally lose your focus. Pretty useful. We also have a giant hood befitting of a giant lens mount. It actually has these two little kind of like cubby drawers in here. Oh, there we go. I believe that these are for holding onto gel filters, because as you can see, this massive lens has a massive front element, and that's not really something that's practical to put a filter on, never mind the types of problems you'd get with vignetting, because this is quite a wide lens. And being a wide lens, why does it have such a huge front element when other lenses on the market, such as Sony's G Master 14mm f1.8, don't? Well, this is for vignetting, and I suspect when we go and look at the samples, we'll see exactly why this particular lens has such a giant piece of glass in front there. That being said, as mentioned a moment ago, we do have a slot on the back here for gel mount filters. I don't really think you will find use for that in astrophotography, so it's there. Unless someone's really intrepid and somehow figures out a way to, get a hydrogen alpha filter or something in there. You probably won't be using it for astro, but for other means or other forms of photography, you might. But that's enough of looking at it. Let's actually look at some samples and see what it can do. Howdy folks, welcome to Lightroom. Here we have 3 sets of samples that we're going to take a look at for this particular lens. We have an untracked set of samples, a set of tracked samples, and then a set of samples that put a really bright star in the corner and give us a bit more of an idea of what the corners are like. So if you haven't watched one of my reviews before, I'll give you a quick and dirty on the methodology. Right now we're using 2 different cameras, Alpha 1 and an A7R Mark V, and for the tracked samples, we're tracking at 60 seconds with the Fornax Mounts LighTrack II. And what I typically do is I'll go from the max aperture and I'll step all the way to f2.8. Personally, I don't feel like there's much value in going beyond that. especially since a lot of the lenses that I do test, start around f1.4, f1.8, maybe f2. But once you're past f2.8, at least for wide angle lenses, for untracked wide angle lenses, there's not a lot of use. That said, this is tracked. You don't really need to track at 14 millimeters, as you'll see here in a second. But for this, we want a torture test. We want to show you exactly what's going on with the lens and all of its good parts and all of its faults. So the tracked ones, like I said, are 60-second long exposures, and you'll notice that they are at ISO 320 on the A7R Mark V, and you might ask yourself, why ISO 320? Well, that's because both actually the Alpha 1 and the A7R Mark V and most of Sony's most recent cameras have dual gain sensors. And what this means is that there are two real ISOs, quote unquote real ISOs. These are two analog amplification steps. And these are the steps that actually change the amount of noise in your image. The rest of the ISO to noise relationship is actually linear, because what the software in your camera does, let's say you're at 320. This is the second base ISO, so that's the second amplification stage. If you go up to, a 6400 or something, all the camera's doing is literally bumping the exposure up, just the same that you can do here in Lightroom or Camera Raw or what have you. And that's digital amplification. That's amplifying all of the noise. It's just boosting it. And what it does do, though, is it locks your highlights in at whatever exposure you're at. One of the advantages with using the base ISO, and it's not a huge advantage, at least in respect to astrophotography, but it is there, is if there's any highlights in your image, it's going to protect them from getting blown out as much as they might. So stars that would, clip here on the right side of the histogram, pure white, you actually retain some information there. So you do retain, the star's colors or what have you. Again, not really important in this type of photography, but it's just the way I do it. And it gives you a fairly clean image, and especially here at 60 seconds, gives you the ability to really focus on the aberrations and not really worry about the image quality of the sensor, that is. Here we have also some untracked samples that are 15 seconds with the Alpha 1, 50 megapixel files. Here it's base ISO, the second one is at 500, which is advantageous for this particular application. And this is also a bit of a torture test. 50 megapixels is still a lot. So doing untracked astro, you're really pushing the lens with that type of resolution anyway. And 15 seconds is just to ensure that there's not too many star trails. And, if this is exactly what you're doing, this is what you can expect. If you're shooting with a A7 IV and A7C Mark II, an A7 III, an A7S III, you're going to enjoy lower and lower resolutions, and thus longer and longer exposure times before you notice any star trailing. That is a benefit of using a lower resolution sensor for astro. That being said, this sensor is pretty good, this camera's pretty good, and at 15 seconds with an f1.4 lens, we're doing all right for exposure. All right, so first thing we're going to do actually is we are going to go take a look at these untracked images, because there's less to see in the aberration department here. Some of that movement, sky movement, does mask some of the aberrations. Here we can see in the center of the frame, actually not a lot of star trails, right? These are round-ish stars, and we have a general lack of any chromatic aberration here on some of the brighter ones, or any spherical distortions. There's like a little loss of contrast as you get on the really bright stars, the lower magnitude stars, but all in all, not too bad. One thing you'll notice, we've got vignetting, so the corners are vignetting, but actually not bad, a fairly decent field as far as exposure goes. If you look at the preview navigator here, you can see where it really cuts in, but not the worst I've seen, which isn't surprising because this lens has a huge front element. It is ginormous, and the reasoning behind that, part of it has to do with the fact that it's a fast aperture, but also that design choice is to make sure that they can reduce vignetting. Let's go take a look in the corners. Here we see we've got some funny shapes. These are aberrations. These are most likely two different types of astigmatism. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Here we've got Andromeda Galaxy. And yeah, the corner is not too bad actually. But we will see in a little bit if that holds up. Overall, pretty happy for f1.4, 15-second exposure. We'll just step down through the range here. 1.6, 1.8, f2, f2.2, 2.5, 2.8. And you can see, obviously, we lose light pretty quickly. Let's see what happens in the corners. Again, we're at f1.4, 1.6, 1.8, 2, 2.2, 2.5, 2.8. Pretty much in darkness there. So it looks like the astigmatism does start to behave a little bit better as we stop down. But that being said, you don't buy the 1.4 lens to shoot at f2.8. I think I probably say that every review, but it's true. So now that we've taken care of that, let's focus here on just the tracked samples here. And I think these are done backwards. So this is, oh, I should also mention I've boosted everything by 2 stops just so that I've got enough exposure, towards the back end there. So if these ones look a little bright, just consider that a way to diagnose the vignetting, and not the fact that I'm lazy. Anyway, here, if we do look at the preview navigator here, we do see that there is that vignetting here, and we've got a fairly big bright patch in the middle, and it kind of dims a little bit as it goes towards the edges, which of course is what you would expect, but not the worst that I've seen. And we've already touched on why. Let's zoom into the center frame here. And yeah, as you would expect, nice round stars, not a lot of chromatic aberration or fringing, so I don't really think that's a problem. And as you might expect in a modern lens, no spherical aberrations really. Let's go into the corners, way out there. That's actually not too bad as far as star shapes go. There is a little bit of wonkiness happening, which we'll explain in a moment. Come out to this one. Oh, here we go. Here we have vague fighter jet shapes. All right, so when you see these little fighter jet shapes, what's actually happening here is something called astigmatism. Some of you might be going, isn't that coma? It is not coma. And we will talk about what coma is in a moment. But astigmatism is the lack of the ability to focus a point of light onto a single point. And it happens in 2 perpendicular axes here. So from the edges to the center, this radius here, radiating out from the center or towards the center, if you're thinking from the edges, that's called tangential astigmatism. So in this case, top left to bottom right, it's creating the one elongation. And then sagittal astigmatism, we've got this circular type of astigmatism. This goes around the edges. It is sort of perpendicular to our tangential astigmatism there. And that's the sagittal astigmatism. They're not the same. They can be of different amounts. They're not necessarily dependent on one another. Ooh, something going on here. That is a fancy firefly in space or something. But you will notice with wide-angle lenses, fast wide-angle lenses, you will get astigmatism. You'll never get a perfect lens. I don't think we have the technology as of yet. But yeah, this is pretty good actually. It's definitely not as bad as I've seen. Mind you, the fact that we're at 14 millimeters does hide some of it. But yeah, more tangential, at least in this corner, or more sagittal than tangential. They almost look like little bees flying through space. Now, I want to make sure we keep in mind I'm at 400% magnification here. This is ridiculously close. No one's ever really going to look at your work like that, or at least they shouldn't. So these little aberrations here, I dare anyone to try and find them on Instagram, for instance. So this is, I think, actually really clean, which I guess is the trade-off of this lens being absolutely gigantic. But yeah, it looks pretty good. You will notice that the shapes, there's always going to be a little bit of directionality, and it's pointing towards the center of the frame. Now, how do we know that this isn't coma? Well, coma is actually something called chromatic aberration, and it's named as such after comets because you would get fuzzy tails behind bright pinpoints like this. And here we're not really getting fuzzy tails. We are getting shapes, but that's due to the astigmatism, but we're not really getting fuzzy tails. And that tells me that we're not really experiencing a lot of coma. There's two types of coma, depending on if it points the tails towards the center or points it towards the edges. Internal coma points towards the center. External coma points towards the edges. All in all, not really seeing much, or any really. And even the astigmatism is pretty good, which is, I mean, I'll take the win. What do you say? Okay, so here we are in the center of the frame. F1.4, 1.6, 1.8, F2, 2.2, F2.5, F2.8. So, yeah, pretty good actually. I'm not seeing any real development of anything in the center. I do apologize that things sort of jump back and forth here. You can see some of the stars here. I think this at 2.8 maybe didn't track quite as clean as the other ones. That said, you know, I think the tracking was actually pretty good. It's over like 8 minutes, not too bad. Or maybe more like 10 minutes. Not a lot of drift. Anyway, that's the center. Let's take a look at the corners. So this is probably the brightest, busiest corner here. We're close to the Milky Way, so we've got more stars. So we'll take a look here. And that's 1.4, 1.6, 1.8, F2, F2.2. You can see that sagittal astigmatism is really starting to tuck its wings in. So these are looking more almost completely round. 2.5 and 2.8. So part of why things look a little cleaner here at 2.8 is because the star itself is a lot brighter than the astigmatism. But all in all, it's not too bad. Wide open. I mean, you could, if you were willing to shoot at f2.8, stop down a bit and essentially erase some of that astigmatism. But again, I don't think that would be a good use of this lens's abilities. So yeah, not terrible. Really not terrible. That being said, we're going to go take a look at a corner torture test here. So one thing that you may or may not notice with various lenses is that when you have a low magnitude star, so a brighter star, past a certain magnitude, you can get more extreme aberrations, especially astigmatism here. So I put Vega up here in the corner, and this is 1.4. We'll run through the whole range again, but this is actually focused in the corner. So keep that in mind. This is not focused in the center. The images that we just looked were focused in the center. These ones now are focused in the corner. That will really highlight the astigmatism. And look at that. That is quite a shape, eh? It's like some kind of little, almost like a little bee or a little bonbon. Well, these are looking a little bit like bees or flies, but this is just something else a little bit. But you know what? That's actually not that bad. Again, we have that tangential astigmatism, the sagittal astigmatism, but it's quite interesting actually. Now, with these types of stars, there are not that many that are ever going to be in your frame. Maybe if you have the summer triangle, you might have a couple. If we look over here at, some of the other brighter stars that we can see, they're not too bad. When viewed at any kind of normal magnification, no one's going to ever know that they had little wings. So unless you're putting one of the brightest stars in the sky right all the way up in the corner and then viewing them at 400%, you're probably not going to notice this. That being said, we'll go through the range here. 1.4, f1.6, f1.8, f2, 2.2, 2.5, and 2.8. This is quite interesting because it actually, I mean, arguably could be said to be worse right now. The sagittal astigmatism has corrected. The tangential has not. In fact, got what looks like some diffraction spikes happening. And right about here, 2.2 to 2.5, those wings tuck in. But, f1.4 I wouldn't say is that much more terrible here than f2.8, at least where the tangential astigmatism is concerned. It's probably going to appear more or less round at any reasonable magnification. So that is your torture test for the corners. And before I forget, because to be honest I did, what about field curvature? Well, we're going to really quickly enable profile corrections. And you can see a couple of things happened actually. I'm just going to come here and reset the exposure. This was out of camera, enable profile corrections. All right, so we can see that there is some flattening. So it looks like this particular lens has a bit of barrel distortion. And there is some attempt at correcting the vignetting here. I think, unfortunately, it's a little bit murky here because the exposure just wasn't actually good enough to really get into the corners. So we're losing some contrast there, but here you can see, and if you watch this star on the left, you can see we're not really losing that much field of view. It's more or less just flattening the middle, stretching the edges out a little bit, but overall, not too bad of a showing from Sigma here. Just boost the exposure by 1 stop. And yeah, you can see here on the corners are pretty washed out. Up here, not as bad. But if you do notice right here in the preview navigator, I don't think the automatic vignetting removal there is doing that great of a job, for being completely honest. So you might need to come in here and tweak it yourself, and or do a little bit of manual correction and see if you can get a nice flat field that way. The nice thing is if you remember this, or if you just reference your settings, or if you're syncing, you won't really have to do that every time. You can just do it once and then sync it. Or if you're using flats, which we typically don't always think to do when we're doing wide field, you can do that. But you can see here the navigator. I find when we're zoomed out, it gives us a little bit of a better view on that. But there you go. All right, folks, I hope you have found this interesting or illuminating. And these samples are all going to be available for download in full resolution RAWs. Check the description for a link. Download them, process them, pixel peep, get a sense for if this lens is the lens for you. But of course, I know they're not fantastic works of art, but they are still my copyright, so I would please ask you to respect it. Please don't post them online. Please don't misrepresent them as your work, etc., etc. Just use them for the intended purpose of assessing this lens. Well, you know what? Not bad performance, I have to say, which, one would hope from a lens that's, again, I'm belaboring it, but just this big, it's huge. But ultimately, I really think that this lens has its place in the bags of certain photographers. If you are doing something that requires a really big aperture, such as Aurora, Milky Way, sure, but something where low light is really a hindrance, this is going to be excellent for that. If I was just shooting Milky Way, do you necessarily need f1.4? To be honest, no, especially with the sensors and the high ISO noise performance that we have these days. It's not sort of a requirement, I would say, but it is a nice to have. That said, hikeability with this lens, if you're getting out there and getting a really specific composition that's far off the beaten path, it is heavy. Depending on your individual, I guess, physical constraints, you might have more success with a smaller lens. But if you can huff it, this is the one that I would personally take. And that said, I am keeping this one in the bag for the time being until something even better comes out. So yeah, it's a great lens, but there's many great lenses out there. So I hope that this has helped you make a decision, or at least make your decision a little bit more clear about what's important to you and what you need in this lens. Thanks so much, and hope we'll see you next time.